now we come to a story which has been termed Hole Henge. Hole, as in poke a hole, not as in entire. Hole Henge, and this is well, I don't know. It for various reasons it intrigues me, but there's one particular aspect that really continues to irritate me about this. But anyway, and this is the news that a massive late Neolithic pit structure associated with Durrington Walls Henge, which is just up the road from Stonehenge, has been uncovered. This is a huge piece of work with many authors, and essentially has established a massive circle of holes with is the diameter? Is it? I forgot what the diameter is. It just now. It's quite massive. Anyway,
Oh,
um,
it's mile. Yes, it's kilometers across.
was it 1.6 kilometers or
Uh,
something?
that's something. Yeah, yeah. I need to check the.
1.9?
It.
No, no. So
You
1.2
should have it.
miles in diameter. There you go.
That's it. That's
1.2
it.
miles in diameter.
Yeah.
Has been discovered in the landscape, and this is okay. First of all, I'm just going to say, and then we can get into some of the stuff that I know you want to talk about. So first of all, let's just say this came in the context of solstice. Solstice is always an interesting time of year for me. I find it fascinating the way that, in particular, for example, the BBC and other news organisations choose to report on summer solstice at Stonehenge. He
Yeah.
says very quickly. Um, but also as well, you always have every year you have this really weird balancing of archaeological and neo-pagan people on, for example, on BBC Breakfast on the morning of well, there on the morning of one of the solstice celebrations, because there's 2 or 3 days when one can choose to celebrate solstice.
Yeah.
We had an archaeologist, Sue Greeny, I think she's based at the Stonehenge site or in the landscape at least, and a neo-pagan
Yeah.
person based at Avebury, um, talking about how they were going to approach solstice and what English Heritage was doing in terms of streaming the solstice sunrise, and how the neo-pagan chap had been gathering sunlight in a crystal ball that morning for the purposes of keeping the light, I think, through the darkness of winter to come, this kind of thing. And what bothers me in the context of this particular story is that then you also have people like the self-proclaimed reincarnated King Arthur, Arthur Pendragon, so-called King of the Druids, which
A
which
magnificent figure.
which bothers me as well, because coming from Wales, Druids have a very particular, they still have a cultural currency in the Eisteddfod and so on and so forth. And to claim yourself as King of the Druids is a very weird thing. But anyway, um, but he should know, should he not? If he is, in fact, the rightful inheritor of this landscape, the protector of it as a druid, of this landscape, and if druids are anything to do with Stonehenge, he should have already known about Hole Henge, this 1.2 mile wide circle in the landscape. But he didn't. And archaeologists have uncovered it. Now this thing, a series of holes, up to 20 meters wide each hole, arranged in a circle. So a circle of holes is very impressive. But, and this is where I'll hand over to you, Andy, it has thrown up all sorts of queries about an ongoing story to do with the Stonehenge landscape, has it not?
Yeah. And put this in context. This it's a very impactful piece of work. All credit to the very large team that's behind it.
Hmm.
It's a multidisciplinary team that's thrown a lot of modern analytical techniques at some established archaeology, some recorded archaeology from the Stonehenge and Avebury World Heritage Site area,
Hmm.
Durrington Walls area, which has been put together with some new work particularly in terms of geophysics
Hmm.
and wide area geophysics and landscape modelling and so on. And it is as I say, it's a very impactful paper. It's clearly caught the imagination of the media as well because it had the magic word, Stonehenge in it at various points.
Stonehenge.
Um, yeah, but also I think it's one of the reasons it's become quite so current is that all credit to them, they published it on Internet Archaeology open access,
Yes.
so it's not kept within the magic circle.
No. The magic
It
circle
is
here
it,
not
it,
being Stonehenge, but being academic publishing more broadly behind
Yeah,
paywalls. Yeah,
yes, the people who have access to the racket that is academic publishing.
yeah.
He said, being uncontroversial. Um, so you have this great archaeological story. It's set within probably Britain's most famous heritage site, with connections to English heritage's biggest cash cow, along with Dover Castle.
Soon to be your
Um,
home, of course, as we've already established.
Absolutely,
Yeah,
I will be receiving people in audience in a few weeks'
at
time.
Dover Castle. Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. Sign up now. Leave your details, so that
And
you can be
well,
tracked
and
and traced
also
if anything goes wrong. And
well, and
so,
bring your tribute to the Brockman throne,
like the tributes that were left at the foot of Winston Churchill's statue, the mini rolls and the.
which we'll get to. Yeah, in a bit. Yep.
See what I did there?
hmm
No, the, so no, brilliant piece of archaeological investigation. Lots to talk about, and it will be talked about for quite some time because it has changed people's understanding of the extent of these monuments in the landscape there.
Yeah. Yeah.
Now, obviously, it begs the question: where else in the country were similar things done, or was this a unique landscape,
Yeah. And well, and
a
also
uniquely
crucially,
special landscape?
yeah. Well, also crucially, it underlines even more so that we need to stop talking about Stonehenge as a monument. It isn't a monument. It is part of a broader landscape meaning and monument, therefore. Particularly, for example, from a primary school perspective, which is one of the places where I interact with this idea an awful lot. Uh, to look at Stonehenge outside of its connection to the river, and in turn to Durrington Walls, and in turn to the Avebury and Silbury and so on and so forth, is, and now obviously this whole henge, is to completely miss the point, short of just saying, well, once or twice a year the sun rises in a particular point in relationship to Stonehenge. Stonehenge is the equivalent of a single stone, really, in a massive landscape-sized monument, and it's a small bugbear. It really, but the focus and the baggage that Stonehenge is given compared to its neighbours, the fact that even Woodhenge, so no, Holehenge, sorry, here is being reported in the context of its relationship to Stonehenge is problematic in terms of public discourse. So I think there's an argument here to be made that we need to try and help people to move away from just fixating on that stone circle. And if you want to look at a stone circle, my suggestion is always, if you are a teacher, is to look at, for example, Castle Rig in the Lake District.
In
It's a
Cumbria,
wonderful in
yeah.
Cumbria, precisely.
Again, beautiful site, wonderful site.
Absolutely. But in that sense, then, so we have this wonderful piece of work, but we also have in the Stonehenge, the Wiltshire landscape, the question of roadworks, significant roadworks that may well be in the
It's not
offing.
roadworks. It's a 1.5 kilometre tunnel and dual carriageways across the middle of it.
I thought I'd let you emphasise it. So, how does this actually impact that then? Because some people are, it seems as though, are immediately calling for a full reassessment of any plans in the landscape, because the argument being, presumably, that we just don't know what we're going to destroy. You know, if you can discover this thing, this sort of monument, in the year 2020, after hundreds of years of intensive study of the landscape, arguably we just don't know what is to be lost if we dig a tunnel. Um, but also there are counterpoints to that argument as well. I mean, what's your assessment of this conversation?
Right. What's really interesting is that almost immediately the story came out, it was seized on by both sides of the argument about the A303 upgrade on Stonehenge, which again takes us back to the government's plans for the economy and to build out of a COVID-19 recession,
hmm
which includes infrastructure.
hmm
Building infrastructure. Now, this is a project that's been talked about for decades.
Mm.
The project to upgrade the A303, and it's currently at the state where a dual carriageway and tunnel under part of the Stonehenge World Heritage Site. The decision is currently with the Secretary of State for Transport, and is due to be announced in the middle of July. I think 17th. I think it is.
Yeah.
Now, this has been controversial. is something of an understatement. It's been controversial for as long as it's been talked about, and the project has fallen for many different reasons for as long as it's been talked about, because it's so difficult and so expensive and so controversial. It appears now that there is more chance of it going ahead than there has been in previous attempts to do it, to build it. But the problem is that many independent archaeologists think it is an absolute abomination to lam a dual carriageway tunnel, lit tunnel portals and so on, and through the middle of a World Heritage Site. And they argue that it is such a special and such a sensitive landscape that the concept of preservation in situ should pertain. And if there is to be archaeological work, it should be measured, incremental, responding to need and evidence, and ideally sort of research-based, rather than forced to a tunnel and a budget at the convenience of Highways England and the government. They also argue, as on a wider point, that for Britain to be seen to do this to a World Heritage Site is an appalling precedent around the world for other governments that might see World Heritage Sites as sometimes an economic inconvenience.
Yes.
Now, the whole henge, if we're going to use that term, and it's great. It's a great term.
It's a really term.
Although we don't actually. But because it's a relatively, it's a relatively new explanation of archaeology that had already been, some of which had already been discovered, other of which is new. It's what archaeology does. It brings together old evidence, new evidence, and generates new evidence, and then comes to a conclusion and sets up a debate. Exactly what should happen. The fact that it's happening on the Stonehenge landscape was picked up by people like Mike Parker Pearson, one of our leading prehistorians now at UCL, University College London, who argued in an article in the Guardian that the discovery of Whole Henge, showing how sensitive some of the archaeology was in that landscape and how much new there was to be discovered, he said this is just another reason to give up this disastrous white elephant of a scheme. Again, a lot of people argue that it's a 1970s solution for 2020's problem, and particularly after COVID, we just don't know what, with probably more people working at home and so on, what transport needs are going to be in 10 years' time. 10 years time. And is shaving 15 or 20 minutes off the trip to the West Country worth it? Worth all this money and all this effort and all this pain, which is what the projections say. That other people.
I don't know, if you're travelling to Bristol to topple the statue, getting there quickly and be able to get away, it's important.
Oh, but you go down the M4 anyway. The A3 is only used to lift the M4 spot.
Oh, well, there you go. You see, I would be a terrible protest organizer. I really would.
Yeah, other people have said that this is a wonderful chance to do a transect of archaeology across the World Heritage Site and think about the wonderful things it's going to uncover. And development archaeology, we're very good at it in this country, which we are. It will be done to a really high standard, and it's polarizing the archaeological world, as it has done ever since it was first proposed. This is just pouring more petrol on the fire, if you like. And in contrast with Mike Parker Pearson, Mike Pitts, who is a specialist in the area and also the editor of British Archaeology, the CBA's archaeology magazine, popular archaeology magazine, wrote a letter to the Guardian basically saying that this is all it's done is point out why the archaeology is so important, but then he's gone on to defend the idea of developer archaeology, and then he said that the arguments for and against the Stonehenge road alterations and the potential costs and benefits are complex, but an archaeological discovery far from any proposed roadworks has no bearing on the tunnel. Now, that is so far from the point. It's in outer space. Because
that's not how you described it yesterday.
we're now recording. Uh,
Indeed, no bleeping necessary, thankfully.
no,
No.
it completely misses the point that first of all, we're talking about an integrated ritual landscape.
Hmm.
Most prehistorians agree on that now.
Hmm. Hmm.
So to say that it's far from any proposed roadworks and has no bearing is just nonsensical.
Yeah. Mm.
Um, and what also it also appears to be trying to divorce the find and the significance of this new find and this new work from the argument about the development archaeology that will be done on the A303.
Mm. Mm.
And um, I think a lot of people will take a different view to what the one that Mike does, which is that this only increases the sensitivity of the archaeology in that World Heritage landscape.
Yeah. Yeah.
Because of the potential for what other things might be there, and the archaeologists should be really, really careful before they back this particular horse that is actually an irrevocable impact on that landscape.
How then does this relate to some of the conversations we've been having earlier on in this watching brief in other segments? In so much as we've talked about, if not strongly hinted at the need for archaeologists to to get the house in order, to try and make a good case to government in the coming months and years about the need to have, God forbid, proper planning process, and maybe actually acknowledging that the heritage environment exists, for example. Um, how does this sort of conversation fit in with that? Because it sounds as though, on the one hand, for some archaeologists, it's very inconvenient to have a difference of opinion about the Wiltshire, Avebury, Stonehenge landscape, um, and arguably, given what we've just been saying about clear messaging, it is inconvenient,
Mm.
but that doesn't seem to be a reason, though, in your opinion, at least, certainly, to try and have a private, quiet conversation and present some sort of united archaeological opinion on this. How how can we negotiate these sorts of things when we also need to be able to communicate clearly to people in Whitehall?
That's a really interesting point and a really nutty point, a crunchy point to try and deal with.
Hmm.
When this story broke, I, as you do when you're on Twitter and commentating on this kind of stuff, I put a tweet out saying, this will have an impact on the A303 upgrade discussion.
Hmm.
It will probably highlight, and it will probably highlight the divisions within the archaeological community about how to approach that particular discussion, that particular controversy.
Hmm.
And then I went and I did suggest really as a discussion point that because Highways England had just put out the tender document for the archaeological work on the A303 extension, even before the decision's been made by the minister,
Hmm.
that it might be good for archaeologists to maybe just wait for the decision to be made irrevocably, for planning consent to be finally granted after all the legal processes have been gone through, minister's decision, potential judicial review, potential further inquiry,
Hmm. Hmm.
because otherwise the risk would be that it would rip apart certainly the bits of professional archaeology that deal with prehistory.
Yes.
And well, there are already frictions within archaeology between academic archaeologists and development commercial archaeologists, for want of a better word. I don't like the word commercial archaeology, but it is archaeology that's developer funded, and that's probably perhaps a better term.
Hmm.
But obviously, developer funded archaeology relies on development projects happening for its bread and butter.
Yes.
And it doesn't take, and although it might observe and reference research agendas, it doesn't do primary research. What it does is provide data for people who do primary research.
Hmm.
That discuss.
Which only further complicates the question of archaeologists and how they relate to Whitehall, doesn't it? In so much as
It,
if
absolutely.
it's your bread and butter, or rather say, if it's the bread and butter for a large portion of this constituency of people who work in the
About
heritage sector,
5,000 people.
there you go. Um, then there is going to be this tension. I suppose. I guess that's precisely what you're highlighting. But as you're right, as you say, how can you go against your essentially indirectly your paymasters on certain issues uh, when arguably not doing so leads to situations where the government can very openly float notions of actually ignoring the heritage requirements of a
Give,
particular area for
give, give,
development
give,
purposes.
yeah, you're absolutely right. I'll give you an example.
Hmm.
That there are, quite rightly, the Chartered Institute for Archaeologists has an ethical code.
Hmm.
And a lot of the ethical code is about are clauses about protecting the heritage, not damaging heritage, properly reporting, and so on.
Hmm.
Now, some people might argue that participation in the destruction of part of a large part of a World Heritage Site irrevocably is an ethical breach.
Hmm.
Other people argue that the ethical breach will be in not doing the archaeology when that destruction is going to happen.
Yeah.
Now we can argue about that, but we can't pretend the argument isn't happening. And in fact, one one colleague who I respect very much, um, in fact, responded to my Twitter thread, but effectively saying, "But you can't say this because you're undermining archaeological expertise by showing that we're divided and we're not speaking with one voice." I'm sorry,
But it's bloody obvious
it's
that we're divided already. I mean,
exactly. It's I'm not creating the argument. I'm just reporting
yeah.
one that
Well, and also,
already exists and has existed for years.
yeah, and also crucially, that distinction, that split, that philosophical and economical um, pull that archaeologists feel in different directions is already
Mm,
exploited to great effect in other places
mm,
and other scenarios
yeah.
by people who local councils up to high office. Um,
Yeah.
so it's a knot. It's a very difficult thing that again we're going to have to probably keep an eye on. But I suppose actually this is, I guess, a pointer to the sorts of conversations that we have to have, or find ways of having more effectively and more professionally, if we are going to tackle some of those other issues that we talked about in this watching
Look,
brief.
yeah, look, I think we're back to where we were at the beginning of this month's whole watching brief package,
Hmm.
which is that archaeologists are going to have to find ways of explaining these very complex ideas,
Hmm.
and the idea that we do debate and discuss and don't come up with a final decision about something, that we are part of an ongoing conversation, but that's good. That's what should happen
Hmm.
in the same way as it should happen in society.
Hmm.
But we're going to have to find ways of explaining that in not more than 20 words on the side of a bus, because that's the level of argument that's happening in national politics at the moment.
Yes.
It's not easy to do.
No.
People who write brilliant academic reports sometimes find it very difficult to talk human.
Yeah.
You know,
Hmm.
I despair every time I see somebody on a television program talking about heritage asset.
Hmm. Hmm.
You know, when they're on a popular news program or something, or
Hmm.
a popular archaeological program, you can sometimes see from the editing the problems that a producer has had in getting usable material out of an academic or professional archaeologist. Okay, not everybody is a Nick Ashton or a Aksha Dave our colleagues who are very good at expressing these complex ideas in simple language.
Hmm.
But there are some people who still think that actually it shouldn't be expressed in simple language because it's too complicated, and sometimes even too complicated for the plebs to understand.
Hmm.
And that's a problem still.
Well, and that, and
Thankfully, increasingly rare, but it's still out there sometimes. And pat on the head, go away, we'll sort this one out. That's not possible anymore.
well, it's not possible, particularly when people in power want to paint that as the problem, if you know what I mean.
Exactly.
When they're trying to characterize you as being that, and also being much more of a problem in the context of development than you actually are. As I say,
Absolutely. It's the
0.02%.
same misrepresentation as Yeah, it's the same misrepresentation as pretending that Keir Starmer can't make up his mind because he can, as a lawyer, he'd represent a guilty client one day and then defend a client the next.
Hmm. Hmm.
You know,
Hmm.
it's a false, it's a straw man. But unfortunately, there's straw people that can gain traction in the popular imagination, and that's what that's one of the we're dealing with the consequences of that at the moment.
Hmm. Yeah.